Ethan pulled his jacket tighter as the wind howled outside his small wooden hut. The blizzard had come suddenly, turning the peaceful, snowy mountains into a raging, frozen wasteland. He stood by the window, watching as the swirling snow made it nearly impossible to see beyond a few feet. Living alone in the mountains had taught him to be prepared for anything. But tonight, the storm felt particularly unforgiving. Ethan sighed and placed another log into the fireplace, the flames crackling warmly in the dimly lit room. Outside, the sound of the storm grew louder, a relentless roar that seemed to shake the walls of his little home. He was about to settle down with a cup of hot coffee when something caught his attention. Through the frost-covered window, Ethan thought he saw movement, a shadowy figure stumbling through the storm. At first, he dismissed it as his imagination. No one in their right mind would be out in such deadly weather. But the figure appeared again, this time closer. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and opened the door, the freezing wind nearly knocking him back. "Hello? Is someone there?" he shouted into the storm. His voice was swallowed by the wind, but the figure moved toward him, staggering weakly. As it drew closer, Ethan realized it was a woman. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her skin had a pale blue tint, and her white hair clung to her face, frozen in clumps. Her clothing, a strange, shimmering fabric, looked out of place in the rugged mountains. She collapsed just a few feet from his doorstep, her body shivering uncontrollably. Without hesitation, Ethan rushed to her side, scooping her up in his arms. She was light, almost fragile, and her skin was icy to the touch. He carried her inside, shutting the door against the storm. The warmth of the fireplace filled the room, but the woman remained curled up on the floor, trembling and clutching a small metallic device. "Hey, it's okay," Ethan said gently, kneeling beside her. "You're safe now." Her eyes snapped open, wide with fear. They were the most striking eyes Ethan had ever seen, a mix of silver and violet that seemed to shimmer in the firelight. She pushed herself away from him, backing into a corner of the room like a frightened animal. "Whoa, whoa, I'm not going to hurt you," Ethan said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. She stared at him, her breathing shallow and rapid. She said something in a language Ethan couldn't understand, her voice trembling. Ethan frowned, trying to make sense of her words, but they were completely alien to him. "It's okay," he repeated softly, grabbing a blanket and holding it out to her. "You're freezing. Here, take this." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between Ethan and the blanket. Finally, she reached out, snatching it from his hands and wrapping it tightly around herself. Ethan sat back, giving her some space. "What were you doing out there?" "You could have frozen to death," he said, more to himself than to her. The woman didn't respond. She kept clutching the metallic device in her hands, her fingers trembling. Ethan noticed it had faint lights on its surface, blinking erratically, as if it were broken. He sighed, unsure of what to do next. Whoever she was clearly terrified. He decided to give her time to calm down. "I'll make you something warm to drink," he said, moving toward the small kitchen. As he worked, he couldn't shake the questions racing through his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why did she seem so afraid of him? For now, Ethan decided, the answers could wait. All that mattered was helping her survive the night. The storm outside wasn't letting up, and neither of them was going anywhere anytime soon. The warm scent of tea filled the small hut as Ethan carefully poured the steaming liquid into a cup. He turned to the woman, still huddled in the corner with the blanket wrapped tightly around her. She hadn't moved much since he brought her inside, and her violet-silver eyes stayed locked on him, watching his every move. He slowly approached, keeping his hands visible to avoid scaring her further. "Here," he said gently, placing the cup on the small table near her. "It'll help warm you up." She didn't respond, her grip on the strange metallic device tightening. Her gaze flicked between Ethan and the cup as if unsure whether it was safe. Ethan sighed and sat on a stool a few feet away, giving her space. He took a sip of his own tea, letting the warmth soothe his throat. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice calm. "I'm just trying to help." The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression softening for a moment, but the fear didn't completely leave her eyes. She whispered something in her strange language, the words musical yet completely foreign to Ethan. "I don't understand," Ethan said, shaking his head. "Do you speak any English?" She stared at him blankly, then pointed at herself and said, "Lyra." Her voice was soft, trembling, but the word was clear. "Lyra," Ethan repeated. He pointed to himself. "Ethan." Her lips moved silently, repeating his name. The tension in her posture seemed to ease just a little. Ethan decided to take another step. He pointed to the teacup. "Tea. It's safe. Drink." Lyra hesitated, then reached out cautiously. Her slender fingers wrapped around the cup, and she brought it to her lips. The moment the warm liquid touched her mouth, her eyes widened. She sipped more eagerly, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of relief on her face. "Good, right?" Ethan said with a small smile. Lyra didn't answer but nodded slightly, her grip on the metallic device loosening as she focused on the tea. Ethan's eyes lingered on the device. It looked like a piece of advanced technology, its small lights blinking erratically. Whatever it was, it seemed important to her. "What's that?" Ethan asked, gesturing to it. At once, Lyra clutched the device tightly to her chest, her fear returning. She shook her head, speaking rapidly in her language. Her tone was defensive, almost pleading. Okay, Ethan said quickly, holding up his hands. "I'm not going to take it. It's yours." She studied him for a moment, her breathing slowing as she seemed to understand his words. Slowly, she relaxed again, though her grip on the device remained firm. Ethan leaned back, trying to piece together what little he knew. Lyra was clearly not from around here. Her pale blue skin, white hair, and otherworldly features were proof enough of that. And that device, it was like nothing he'd ever seen. As the fire crackled in the background, Ethan spoke again, more to himself than to Lyra. "What were you doing out there in the middle of a blizzard? You're lucky I saw you." Lyra didn't answer, but her expression shifted. She glanced toward the window, her eyes narrowing, as if she were worried about something, or someone, outside. Ethan noticed her sudden unease. "Is someone looking for you?" he asked. Lyra's head snapped toward him. She nodded slowly, then said something in her language, her tone urgent. She pointed to the door, then mind running, her gestures frantic. "You're running from someone," Ethan guessed, his chest tightening. Lyra nodded again, her expression a mix of fear and desperation. Ethan's mind raced. If someone, or something, was chasing her, it wasn't safe for either of them. He glanced at the rifle mounted on the wall, a relic from his hunting days. "Don't worry," he said firmly, trying to reassure her. "You're safe here." But deep down, Ethan wasn't sure how true that was. The storm outside was raging, but he had a feeling the real danger hadn't even begun. For now, all he could do was wait, and prepare for whatever was coming. The storm outside raged on, howling like a living creature determined to tear through the walls of Ethan's small hut. Inside, the tension between him and Lyra remained thick, though a fragile sense of trust was beginning to form. Lyra sat near the fire now, no longer huddled in the corner, her violet-silver eyes flickering between Ethan and the door as if ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Ethan decided to try again. He pointed at the fire and said, "Fire. Warm." Lyra tilted her head, studying the flames as if she had never seen fire before. Her lips moved slightly as she repeated, "Fire." A small smile spread across Ethan's face. "That's right. Fire." She gave a cautious nod, then pointed at herself. "Lyra." "Yeah, I remember," Ethan said, nodding. He pointed to himself. "Ethan." Her expression softened, and for the first time, there was a faint glimmer of something other than fear in her eyes. curiosity. Encouraged, Ethan tried another step. He gestured to the metallic device she clutched tightly. "What's that?" "Device." Lyra's grip on it tightened immediately, her expression hardening. She shook her head and muttered something in her language, her voice low and guarded. Okay, Ethan said quickly, raising his hands in surrender. "I won't touch it. It's yours." She watched him carefully for a moment, then relaxed slightly, though her grip on the device didn't loosen. Ethan sighed, realizing that whatever it was more than just important to her. It was likely her only lifeline. Deciding to give her some space, Ethan stood and moved to the kitchen area. He rummaged through his supplies, pulling out some bread and a jar of peanut butter. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he prepared a makeshift meal, he couldn't help but glance back at Lyra. She was watching him intently, her eyes following every movement he made. He placed a plate of food on the table near her and gestured to it. "Food. Eat." Lyra hesitated, her gaze flicking between the plate and Ethan. Slowly, she reached out and picked up a piece of bread, sniffing it cautiously before taking a small bite. Her eyes widened, and she quickly took another bite, chewing eagerly. Ethan chuckled. "Guess you were hungry, huh?" Lyra didn't respond, but her expression softened further as she ate. Ethan sat across from her, leaning back in his chair. "So, Lyra," he began, knowing she couldn't understand him, but speaking anyway. "You're running from someone, right?" You pointed at the door, like you're scared they'll come for you. Lyra froze mid-bite, her eyes locking onto Ethan's. Slowly, she nodded, her expression tense again. She set down the bread and gestured to the device in her hands. It emitted a faint hum and a series of blinking lights, though it seemed damaged. Ethan frowned. "That thing, is it a tracker? A beacon?" Lyra shook her head, her voice rising as she spoke rapidly in her language. She gestured to the device, then to the window, miming as if sending out a signal. Ethan realized she was trying to explain, but her words were lost on him. Okay, he said, holding up his hands. "I get it. It's important. But if someone's chasing you, are they tracking you with that thing?" Lyra hesitated, then slowly shook her head. She tapped the device and pointed at herself, then at the window again. Ethan tried to piece it together. "It's for you. To call someone. Help?" Her face lit up, and she nodded vigorously. Ethan sighed in relief. At least it wasn't leading her pursuers straight to them. The moment was interrupted by a loud crash outside, the sound of something heavy falling in the storm. Lyra jumped to her feet, clutching the device tightly. Her eyes darted toward the door, her fear returning in full force. Ethan grabbed the old rifle from the wall, his heart pounding. "Stay here," he said firmly, though he knew she couldn't understand. Lyra shook her head, taking a step closer to him. It was clear she didn't want to be left alone. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but stay behind me." Together, they moved toward the door. Whatever was out there, Ethan knew they had to face it together. The fragile peace they had built was about to be tested, and he wasn't sure either of them was ready for what was coming. Ethan opened the door cautiously, the freezing wind hitting him like a slap. Snow swirled in chaotic patterns, reducing visibility to mere feet. He gripped the rifle tightly, his knuckles turning white. Lyra stood just behind him, her slim frame trembling, not from the cold but from fear. Her violet-silver eyes darted nervously toward the storm, scanning the white abyss for something Ethan couldn't yet see. The sound came again, a loud thud, like metal striking wood. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching against the thick layer of snow. He squinted into the blizzard, trying to locate the source of the noise. Lyra clung to the doorframe, her hands clutching the metallic device tightly against her chest. "Stay here," Ethan said firmly, though he doubted she understood. He pointed at the ground, gesturing for her to remain inside. Lyra shook her head, her expression tense. She pointed toward the storm, saying something in her language. Though the words were unfamiliar, Ethan could hear the urgency in her voice. "All right, but stay close," he said, giving up. He stepped off the porch, moving slowly toward the sound. His every step felt heavy, the thick snow pulling at his legs. Lyra followed cautiously, her gaze darting in every direction. They didn't have to go far. Just a few feet from the hut, Ethan spotted something that sent a chill down his spine. Tracks, large, deep impressions in the snow, led toward the woods behind his home. They weren't human, nor were they from any animal Ethan recognized. The shapes were too uniform, too mechanical. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered, kneeling to examine the marks. They were spaced evenly, as if made by some kind of machine. Lyra crouched beside him, her breathing quick and shallow. She pointed at the tracks, then at the woods, her expression growing more frantic. Ethan straightened, scanning the tree line. He couldn't see anything through the thick snowfall, but his instincts told him they weren't alone. "Is this who you're running from?" he asked, gesturing to the tracks. Lyra nodded rapidly, her fear now impossible to hide. She spoke again, her voice rising as she gestured toward the hut, and then the woods, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. Ethan couldn't understand her, but the message was clear. Whatever had made those tracks, it was close, and it was looking for her. "Let's get back inside," Ethan said, grabbing her arm gently. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then allowed herself to be pulled toward the safety of the hut. Once inside, Ethan bolted the door and dragged a heavy wooden table in front of it for extra security. Lyra paced the room, clutching the metallic device as if it were her lifeline. She kept glancing toward the door, her anxiety filling the small space like a heavy fog. Ethan took a deep breath and leaned the rifle against the wall. "All right," he said, turning to Lyra. "You need to tell me what's going on, who's after you, and why." Lyra stared at him, her eyes glistening with tears. She pointed to the device in her hands and tapped it repeatedly. It emitted a faint hum, its lights blinking erratically. Ethan realized it wasn't just a random gadget. It was some kind of communication tool. "You're trying to call for help," Ethan guessed. Lyra nodded, her expression desperate. She said something, her tone pleading, then pointed to the device again and mimed typing on it. Ethan frowned. "It's broken, isn't it?" She nodded again, this time with a defeated look. Ethan's mind raced. If this thing could send a signal, maybe it could call off whoever, or whatever, was out there. But fixing it was another matter. He had no idea how alien technology worked. Still, he wasn't about to give up. "Let me take a look at it," he said, holding out his hand. Lyra hesitated, clutching the device protectively. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't let go. But then, with a trembling hand, she placed it in his palm. Ethan sat down at the table, examining the device closely. Its surface was smooth and metallic, with small lights flickering across its surface. It looked far more advanced than anything he'd ever seen, but there were clear signs of damage. A crack running along one side, and a small panel that seemed slightly loose. "I'm no expert," Ethan said, glancing at Lyra, "but I'll try." Lyra sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched him work. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but Ethan knew their biggest challenge wasn't the blizzard. It was whatever was following those tracks, and he had a feeling it wouldn't stop until it found them. Ethan worked carefully, turning the strange device over in his hands as Lyra watched anxiously from across the table. The fire crackled in the background, but its warmth did little to calm the growing tension in the small hut. Ethan had managed to pry open the damaged panel on the side of the device, revealing a tangle of delicate circuits and glowing wires that pulsed faintly with light. "Well, this is definitely not something I can fix with duct tape," Ethan muttered under his breath, his brow furrowed. Lyra leaned forward, her violet silver eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She gestured toward the device, and then mimed twisting something, her hands trembling. Ethan got the gist of what she meant. "You're saying it needs adjustment. "Okay, I'll try it," he said, carefully using his pocket knife to nudge one of the loose wires back into place. The device let out a soft hum, and the lights blinked faster. Lyra's face lit up for a moment, but the sound of a distant, mechanical whirring outside wiped away her relief. Her head snapped toward the window, her body going rigid. Ethan froze, listening intently. The whirring sound grew louder, followed by the unmistakable crunch of snow under something heavy. He glanced at Lyra, whose wide eyes confirmed his worst fear. Something was coming. He stood quickly, grabbing the rifle from where it rested against the wall. "Stay here," he said firmly, though he doubted she would listen. Lyra shook her head, pointing at the door and then at herself. She spoke urgently in her language, her tone leaving no room for argument. She wasn't going to hide. "All right," Ethan said with a sigh, "but stay behind me." He moved toward the window, peering through the frost-covered glass. At first, all he could see was the swirling snow, but then a shadow emerged, large, metallic, and unmistakably unnatural. As it drew closer, Ethan's stomach sank. It was a machine, a towering drone with spindly legs and a glowing red sensor where its head should have been. Its movements were deliberate, scanning the area as it advanced. Behind it, two smaller drones followed, their sleek forms cutting through the storm like predators on the hunt. "Great," Ethan muttered. "Just great." Lyra grabbed his arm, pulling him back from the window. She pointed at the device on the table, and then at the drones, speaking rapidly. Ethan understood enough. Those things were looking for her, and the device might be their only chance to stop them. "We don't have time," Ethan said. "If they get here, we're done." Lyra shook her head, grabbing the device and clutching it tightly. She began to work on it herself, her fingers moving with surprising speed and precision. Ethan watched her for a moment, then turned his attention back to the window. The drones were closer now, their mechanical limbs moving effortlessly through the deep snow. Ethan's heart raced. He had faced wild animals in the mountains before, but this was different. These machines weren't just hunting. They were designed to kill. "I'll try to slow them down," Ethan said, heading for the door. Lyra grabbed his sleeve, her eyes pleading. She shook her head and pointed to the device, as if to say, "Trust me." Ethan hesitated. He wanted to believe she could fix it in time, but the odds didn't look good. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, but if this doesn't work, we're making a run for it." Lyra didn't respond. She was completely focused on the device, her hands moving in a blur as she connected wires and tapped on its surface. The hum grew louder, and the lights began to stabilize, glowing steadily now. The sound of the drones was almost deafening as they reached the edge of the hut. Ethan gripped the rifle tightly, his finger hovering over the trigger. He knew it wouldn't do much against machines like these, but it was better than nothing. Suddenly, the device in Lyra's hands emitted a high-pitched tone. She looked up, her expression a mix of triumph and urgency. She pointed at the door and then at Ethan, shouting something he couldn't understand. "What do you need me to do?" Ethan asked, but there was no time for answers. The door shuddered as the first drone slammed into it, the wood cracking under the impact. Ethan turned to Lyra, his jaw tightening. Whatever she had done, it needed to work, and fast. The door shook violently as the drone outside rammed against it again, splintering the wood. Ethan backed away, his heart pounding. Lyra stood behind him, gripping the repaired device tightly, her face pale but determined. The next hit shattered the door completely, sending wooden shards flying across the room. The lead drone stepped into the hut, its glowing red sensor scanning the interior. Its smaller companions followed, their sleek, spindly legs moving with mechanical precision. Ethan raised his rifle and fired. The loud crack echoed in the small space, but the bullet ricocheted off the drone's metal frame, leaving nothing but a scratch. "Of course," Ethan muttered under his breath, stepping back as the drones advanced. Lyra shouted something, her voice sharp and commanding. She pointed at the device in her hands, then gestured toward the drones. Ethan didn't understand her words, but her urgency was clear. She needed time. "All right," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll keep them busy." Ethan grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the closest drone. The chair shattered on impact, but the force caused the drone to stumble slightly, giving him a moment to dart behind the table. The second drone lunged at him with a sharp metallic appendage, narrowly missing as Ethan ducked. Lyra crouched in the corner, frantically pressing buttons on the device. It emitted a series of beeps and whirs, its lights pulsing faster with each adjustment. "Any time now, Lyra," Ethan shouted as he dodged another attack. The lead drone turned its attention to Lyra, its red sensor locking onto her. It raised one of its limbs, which unfolded into a glowing weapon. Ethan's stomach dropped as he realized what was about to happen. "No, you don't," he yelled, grabbing a heavy iron skillet from the kitchen counter and hurling it at the drone. The skillet struck the weapon, causing it to misfire. Sparks flew, and the drone momentarily staggered. Lyra glanced at Ethan, her eyes wide with gratitude but also fear. She pressed one final button on the device, and it emitted a loud, high-pitched tone that made the drones freeze in place. The room went eerily silent for a moment, the drones standing motionless like statues. Ethan stared at them, his breath catching in his throat. What just happened? Lyra stood slowly, holding the device up. She pointed at the drones, then mind-pulling something toward herself. Ethan guessed she had activated some kind of override. "They're not moving." "That's good," Ethan said, lowering the rifle slightly. "But for how long?" As if in answer, the drones began to twitch, their limbs jerking as if trying to break free of the device's control. Lyra shouted something, her voice rising in panic. She pointed toward the window, and then at Ethan, gesturing for him to follow. "You want to run?" Ethan asked, realizing they had no other choice. "All right, let's go." He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the window. With one swift motion, he smashed the glass with the butt of the rifle and helped Lyra climb through. The freezing wind hit them instantly, but there was no time to worry about the cold. The drones began to move again, their systems rebooting. One of them let out a mechanical screech as it turned toward the broken window. Ethan climbed through just as a red laser beam shot past him, hitting the wall and leaving a scorch mark. "Go," Ethan shouted, pushing Lyra forward. They sprinted into the blizzard, the snow whipping around them in blinding gusts. Ethan's lungs burned with every breath of icy air, but he didn't dare slow down. He could hear the drones behind them, their mechanical limbs crunching through the snow with terrifying speed. Lyra suddenly stopped and turned, holding up the device. It emitted another high-pitched sound, and the drones faltered again, their movements slowing. Ethan grabbed her hand. "We can't stop here. Let's move." They ran deeper into the woods, the dense trees providing some cover from the drone's sensors. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. Finally, they reached a small ravine, the snow covering its edges. Ethan pulled Lyra down behind a boulder, both of them gasping for air. "You've got to tell me," Ethan said, his voice shaky. "Can that thing stop them for good?" Lyra looked at the device, her expression grim. She shook her head and pointed at the drones, then mimed an explosion with her hands. Ethan nodded, understanding her meaning. "We need to destroy them." He gripped the rifle tightly, preparing himself for what was to come. The fight wasn't over yet, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let those machines take Lyra without a fight. Ethan crouched behind a large boulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The blizzard howled around them, but the wind's icy grip couldn't match the cold fear settling in his chest. Lyra sat next to him, her violet-silver eyes scanning the trees nervously, her hands clutching the device tightly. The drones were still out there, and from the sounds echoing through the snow, they were closing in. "They won't stop, will they?" Ethan whispered, his eyes flicking from Lyra to the forest ahead. Lyra shook her head slowly, her face tense with worry. She pointed at the device, then at the forest, her fingers trembling. She made a gesture like pulling something toward herself, then mimed an explosion. "I get it," Ethan muttered. "You think we can use the device to destroy them, but we don't have much time." He glanced over his shoulder, his hand instinctively going to the rifle slung across his back. "We'll need a distraction, something to keep them busy while you do. Whatever you need to do." Lyra's expression softened, and she gave him a firm nod. Her determination was obvious, but so was the fear in her eyes. Ethan didn't need to speak her language to understand she was scared. Scared of failing, of being caught, and of what might happen if she couldn't stop the drones in time. Ethan took a deep breath and clenched his fists. He knew what he had to do, and he was ready. The snow-covered ravine stretched out before them, but their position was precarious. They needed to get to higher ground, where they could see the drones coming from a distance. From there, maybe he could keep them distracted long enough for Lyra to do her part. The sound of the drones grew louder, cutting through the storm like the roar of beasts. The mechanical whirring sent shivers down his spine, and he glanced at Lyra one last time. She was already standing, moving closer to the edge of the ravine. "No," Ethan whispered urgently, grabbing her arm. "Stay low. I'll draw them away." Lyra stared at him, her face unreadable. Then, without warning, she grabbed his hand and pressed the device into his palm. She spoke a few words, too fast for him to understand, but her tone was clear. She was asking him to trust her. Ethan squeezed her hand, nodded, and quickly moved toward the edge of the ravine. The drones were getting closer, their shadows moving swiftly through the snow. He needed to act fast. Ethan took the rifle and aimed it into the trees, firing a warning shot into the distance. The sound echoed sharply in the wind, but the drones didn't hesitate. They turned in his direction, their sensors locking onto him with chilling precision. "Come on, you metal idiots," Ethan muttered, his pulse racing. He fired another shot, this time closer, and then sprinted in the opposite direction, hoping the drones would follow. The crunch of his boots in the snow was the only sound he could hear over the storm. He had to stay ahead of them. He couldn't let them get close to Lyra. He pushed his body harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs, knowing he was the distraction. He knew what he was risking. Behind him, he heard the drones advancing, their mechanical whirring growing louder with every step. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. If they followed him, Lyra would have the time she needed. He glanced over his shoulder. The drones were nearly upon him, their glowing red sensors locked in. He fired again, one last shot, before diving into the snow, rolling to the side to avoid the laser blast that followed. As he scrambled to his feet, he saw a flicker of light out of the corner of his eye. Lyra had activated the device, and it was glowing brightly, brighter than before. A high-pitched whir of energy filled the air as she held it above her head, her face a picture of concentration. Ethan's eyes widened. "Now, Lyra," he shouted. The blast hit the drones like a bolt of lightning, sending a surge of energy through the air. The lead drone screeched as its system overloaded, sparks flying from its joints. The others staggered, their movements erratic as they tried to regain control. Ethan's heart raced as he dove toward the trees, aiming for higher ground. He had done his part, but the fight wasn't over yet. The explosion wasn't enough to destroy them entirely. It only slowed them down. The real danger wasn't the drones themselves. It was their relentless pursuit. Lyra shouted something, her voice desperate, but Ethan didn't stop. He pushed on, knowing they were both running out of time. The storm raged on around them, but in that moment, all that mattered was reaching safety and hoping they could stay one step ahead. The wind howled as Ethan pushed through the thick snow, his legs aching from the long run. Behind him, the drones were still struggling to regain control, their movements jerky and erratic. He glanced over his shoulder, but the storm had swallowed up their pursuit for now. He couldn't risk stopping. He had to keep going, had to make it to higher ground. Lyra was close behind, Her eyes locked on him as they ran through the snow-covered forest. Her hands gripped the device tightly, and Ethan could see the determination in her eyes. Whatever she had done, it had worked, but they both knew it wasn't enough. The drones wouldn't stop until they found her. "Keep moving," Ethan shouted over his shoulder, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He had no idea if Lyra understood him, but the urgency in his voice was clear. They had to reach the top of the hill ahead, where they could find cover. Lyra nodded, her pace quickening as she followed him. She was stronger than Ethan had given her credit for, her movements fluid and precise despite the snow and the cold. The device in her hand seemed to glow brighter with every step, as if it were still drawing power from the energy burst that had slowed the drones. Ethan pushed forward, his eyes scanning the trees for any signs of movement. The blizzard made it hard to see much, but he could feel the tension in the air. They were close. The storm was beginning to thin, and the hilltop was in sight. As they reached the base of the hill, the sound of the drones returned. This time, it wasn't the distant hum of malfunctioning machines. It was the steady, menacing whir of a group that had regained control. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, turning to Lyra. She had stopped a few steps behind him, her eyes wide with fear. The device in her hands flickered erratically, the lights dimming slightly. "Go," Ethan shouted, his voice tight with panic. He grabbed her arm and pulled her up the hill, his mind racing. If they could just make it to the top, they might have a chance to. A loud blast echoed through the forest, and Ethan felt a sudden jolt of fear. The ground shook beneath them, and the snow around them exploded in a spray of white. The drones had fired, and the shockwave sent them both tumbling backward. Ethan grunted as he landed hard on the ground, his head spinning. He heard Lyra cry out, and his heart skipped a beat. When he sat up, his eyes darted around, trying to locate her. Lyra was lying a few feet away, her body partially buried in the snow. She was still conscious, but her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with pain. Ethan scrambled to her side, pulling her out of the snow and checking her over quickly. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low with concern. Lyra nodded weakly, but she didn't speak. Her hand was still clutching the device, though her grip seemed weaker now. Ethan's heart sank. The blast had done more damage than he thought, and he wasn't sure how much longer she could keep fighting. "We need to get you out of here," Ethan said urgently, looking around for a way out. But the drones were closing in fast, their red sensors glowing through the swirling snow. Suddenly, there was a distant sound, louder than the wind, a low hum that seemed to vibrate the air. Ethan turned sharply, his eyes narrowing in confusion. Through the haze of snow, he saw a faint shape in the distance, moving quickly toward them. It was too big to be a drone. A ship. Ethan's heart raced with hope. "Lyra," he shouted, turning to her. Her eyes were already locked onto the ship, a look of recognition crossing her face. "It's them," she whispered, her voice weak but relieved. "They've come for me." Ethan didn't need any more explanation. "We have to move, now." He helped Lyra to her feet, supporting her as they moved toward the ship. The drones were almost upon them, but the ship, an advanced-looking vessel with sleek, silver surfaces, was coming in fast. Its engines hummed loudly as it lowered itself into the clearing, its lights flashing bright through the snow. Just as the first drone lunged toward them, a beam of light shot from the ship, striking the drone and disintegrating it instantly. Ethan flinched at the brightness but didn't stop running. Lyra, her face filled with relief, pushed forward with renewed strength. They reached the ship just as the remaining drones began to fire. The ship's hatch opened, and a figure emerged, a tall, armored person, a member of Lyra's race, with the same pale blue skin and white hair. "Lyra," the figure called out, rushing to meet them. "We've got you." With a final push, Ethan and Lyra climbed aboard the ship. The hatch closed behind them, and the ship ascended, leaving the blizzard and the destroyed drones far below. Lyra turned to Ethan, her face softening with gratitude. She reached out and touched his arm, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You saved me," she said quietly. The ship flew higher, its engines humming softly as it cut through the blizzard below. Ethan sat in a seat near the wall, his body still aching from the fight, but his heart was lighter. He looked over at Lyra, who was resting quietly beside him, her eyes closed but a faint smile on her lips. She had been through so much, and yet she was still here, alive and safe, thanks to their teamwork. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened in such a short time. Just a few days ago, he had been living his quiet, solitary life in the mountains, never imagining that he would meet someone like Lyra, someone from another world. He never expected to find himself risking everything for a stranger, yet now here they were, flying through the clouds, far away from the danger they had just escaped. He looked out the small window, watching as the snowstorm grew smaller beneath them. The dark, swirling clouds faded into the distance, replaced by a clear, starry sky. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt like he could breathe easy. They had made it. They had survived. Lyra stirred beside him, her eyes slowly opening. She blinked a few times, adjusting to the dim light of the ship's interior. Her gaze met Ethan's, and she smiled, a warm, grateful expression that made his chest tighten with relief. "You did it," she said softly, her voice still weak from the ordeal, but full of sincerity. "You saved me." Ethan smiled back, his exhaustion melting away at her words. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. "You were the one who kept the drones from catching us. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't be here." Lyra's expression softened. She reached for the device that had helped them both so much. It was still in her hands, but it seemed more fragile now, the glowing lights dimmer than before. She looked at it for a moment, then placed it carefully beside her. "It's broken now," she said quietly, "but it did what it was meant to do. It saved us." Ethan nodded. "I don't know what it is, but it's amazing. You're lucky to have something like that." Lyra's smile faded slightly as she looked down at the device, her fingers lightly tracing its surface. "I'm not sure luck had much to do with it," she said, her voice quieter. "I wasn't supposed to be out there in the first place." Ethan raised an eyebrow, curious, but not wanting to push too hard. "What do you mean? I thought you were just escaping those drones." Lyra sighed, her eyes darkening slightly as she glanced out the window. "It's more complicated than that. I'm not just some lost traveler." She hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I come from a planet called Viridia. My people are part of a much larger alliance, but things haven't been going well. I defied my leaders, and they exiled me because of it. The device, it was my way of getting out, of calling for help." Ethan listened intently, his mind processing her words. "You were exiled?" he asked softly. "What did you do?" Lyra paused before answering. "I wasn't willing to follow their orders anymore. I didn't agree with their ways of controlling other civilizations, including yours. I wanted to stop the violence. I wanted to help, but they didn't see it that way." Ethan's eyes softened as he understood the weight of her situation. He had no idea what it must have been like to be part of something so much bigger than anything he could comprehend. "Sounds like you were trying to do the right thing," he said, his voice filled with empathy. "I thought so," Lyra replied, her gaze distant. "But now, I'm not sure where I belong anymore. I can't go back, and I don't know if I can ever trust anyone from my world again." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to figure everything out right now. You're safe, and that's what matters." She smiled faintly, nodding. "I suppose you're right. For now, I need to learn what it means to live outside of the shadows of my people's mistakes." Ethan leaned back in his seat, feeling the new sense of determination. "You'll figure it out. And maybe you don't have to do it alone." Lyra turned to look at him, her eyes softening. She nodded slowly. "Maybe I don't." The ship continued to glide through the sky, the stars growing clearer as the storm below vanished completely. Ethan looked out the window once more, realizing that his life had just been changed in ways he never imagined. And while he wasn't sure what the future would hold for him or for Lyra, he knew one thing: they had both been given a second chance. As the ship sailed on, Ethan felt a new sense of hope. It wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning of something bigger, something that he and Lyra would face together.